Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Anne McKenna. I am the Program Coordinator for the Africa Oxford Initiative. I'm delighted to welcome you all to our very first AfOx live digital insaka. Many thanks for joining us from wherever you're joining us across the world. For those who are interacting with AfOx for the first time, the Africa Oxford Initiative is a network of over 3,000 academics and researchers whose aim is to facilitate equitable and sustainable research and academic partnerships between the University of Oxford and African institutions. Now, the AfOx Insaka is a networking platform that draws attention to exciting multidisciplinary research that is relevant for Africa's development. And as usual, we have two speakers from very diverse disciplines. We're delighted to be joined today by Professor Carlos Lopes, all the way from South Africa, and Dr. Jennifer Mabuka, who will be joining us shortly from Seattle. So allow me now to introduce our first speaker for today, Professor Carlos Lopes. Carlos is a professor at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town. And if I was to start counting down all his accolades, we probably will finish this insaka with just that. But some of them include serving as a secretary, executive secretary at UNECA, the UN Economic Commission for Africa. He's authored and edited several books, and you better get yourself a copy of the latest one, Africa in Transformation. And Carlos is posing an interesting question for us today. Is Africa obliged to trade between lives and livelihoods in the face of COVID-19? So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Carlos Lopes.
Well, first of all, thank you, Anne, for your very generous introduction and for the Oxford Africa Initiative for this invitation. I really am very happy to participate in the insaka. We are, of course, limited these days by not being physically next to each other, but it is also a chance to be able to talk to you from South Africa and for all of you to join in this interesting topic. Of course, if we are dealing with the pandemic in Africa these days, we immediately think of Ebola. Because it was the last time that we were associated with some sort of catastrophism. In this case, it was not global, it was more Africa-focused or Africa-centered. But I remember very vividly that during that time, the predictions for Africa's economic impact resulting from the Ebola were quite catastrophic. In fact, the World Bank published a study early on during the pandemic, expecting about $33 billion worth of damage or loss in the African combined GDP. I remember I was at the time at the Economic Commission for Africa fighting hard this supposed evidence because it was made on the basis of a certain number of predictions that I felt were not corresponding to reality. And indeed, at the end of the day, we predicted that it was not possible to have $33 billion damage because the three countries most affected at the time, Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia, together had a combined GDP of only 6 billion. The end result was a study by the World Bank effectively putting the target 2.8 billion. So you can see the discrepancy, and this discrepancy is very important for us to remind everybody when they are looking into how the pandemic is going to affect Africa. We have seen already the World Health Organization changing their predictions about the impact in Africa from a sanitary point of view, but also the lethality of this pandemic quite dramatically. From 3 million at the beginning of their predictions, we are now at 180-something thousand. Possible deaths resulting from the pandemic. I don't know whether the reality of the figures at the end will be, but what I know is that this catastrophism is not helpful when we try to basically prepare ourselves to deal with the socioeconomic impacts of this pandemic. What are the lessons learned? The lessons learned is that Africa has a certain level of knowledge about community dimensions of pandemics that other regions of the world don't. That we have certainly tested voluntarism and mobilizing volunteer work to deal with this type of phenomena, that we know more about contact tracing, that we have a quite acute understanding of food supplies, key role in informal economies, that water and sanitation is not available. Therefore, it's not a good point to try to implement policies that do not respond to the realities on the ground, and water and sanitation being so crucial for hygiene conditions. That shutdowns, when they are done indiscriminately, they actually don't help, because they curtail access to supplies, they create all kinds of other difficulties. And we know also that the cost of lockdowns on the economies are such that we will not really result from their implementation in something really meaningful in terms of addressing the main crisis challenges. As I like to say, we cannot confine inequality, we cannot confine poverty, therefore rush for confinement without taking into account these conditions is not going to help. We have a certain level of resilience, we need to test exactly what it is. New versions of resource nationalism, land nationalism are now, trying to promote traditional responses to a virus that we don't know much about. So trying to not take science into account. All of this should be discarded. And we also should be very much aware of the fact that we have absence of data quality in Africa. Civil registration is very poor. So our predictions, our testing, all these elements that are, being used for very complex projections and very complex modeling are really very difficult to adhere to in the current conditions that we face in Africa. So it is indeed a new pandemic, but as we can see from what I just said, it is not something that was unexpected. Health intelligence knew this could happen and it will still happen. Specialists' advice was pointing in the same direction. So we should have expected more preparedness at the global level. But what we see is that lack of preparedness, but we also see that once again, Africa, despite some degree of knowledge that has been accumulated from previous experiences, HIV, AIDS, and Ebola being the most important, is still has to face the short end of the stick. Solidarity is evaporating. The famous Agenda 23 of the UN, leave no one behind, is already leaving us behind, because there are lots of rules that are not being applied to others, but are being applied to Africa. Let me start with some examples. The restrictions recently introduced by the US and European countries for exports of vital medicines, reagents, respiratory personnel, protective equipment affect African countries heavily. And it is also a wake-up call to think about how the continent should deal with pharmaceutical regulation, health-related procurement, the manufacture of medicines and products in areas that are critical for us, like the ones that have been identified as a result of COVID-19. We know that Africa carries 25% of the world's disease burden and accounts for less than 1% of the global health expenditure. This is the point that everybody wants to underline. I would add, it manufactures less than 2% of the medicines it consumes. So over 2/3 of the world's HIV cases, 93% of the deaths due to malaria currently occur in Africa. And yet, now the continent is not prepared in terms of its capacity to respond. 40% of the global deaths of under 5, mainly due to neonatal causes that we all know are very easy to deal with in most countries. Diarrhea, measles, HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria. The tragedy is that these diseases are treatable, and we know that we could have done better. So what's new with COVID-19? What's new is that so far treatment is tentative everywhere, but for sure dependent on ventilators, as we say, and access to medicines that deal with comorbidities and boosting capable of boosting immunity systems. And we know that COVID-19 drives the message home. In times of crisis, borders close for what is essential, and Africa is left further behind. Africa's capacity for pharmaceutical research and development is poor. We know that overall 37 African countries have some pharmaceutical production, but only South Africa really produces some active pharmaceutical ingredients. And this is definitely not enough. And as a result, the supply of African pharmaceuticals is highly dependent on foreign funding, imports that have closed their doors during this pandemic. Yet, COVID-19 has demonstrated some hidden capacity to produce masks, tests, and other essential goods for the response throughout Africa. This capacity needs to be nurtured. It is part of the industrialization needs that I defend very much for structural transformation processes in Africa. But Africa must get readier for the impact also of new technologies in the world of work, in the world of production systems. And after being praised for its leadership in mobile banking, we all talk about it, Africans should also embrace more ambitious goals in the digital space. And what we have seen during this crisis is a demonstration that this is possible. Without more modern forms of economic transaction, it is not going to be possible to increase the effectiveness of our responses on the educational and health sector, but also making sure that our administration, our management, our bureaucracy, basically catapults itself to the new century. Africa's industrialization and services transformation, in fact, depends on this capacity for us to tap into our largest reserve of digital natives, because we may have people in slums at the present, or a lot of people in slums, but with the youngest population in the world, it is in Africa that the new technologies have the highest potential for adaptation, because that's where the consumption market is going to be in the future, with young people, provided we are not limited to just be passive consumers of content, and we are also participants in this process. And COVID-19 is just telling us we need to reinforce this potential. If we are going to look into the 53 countries out of 54, almost 100%, that have closed their school systems during this crisis, we realize that the discussion about digital space is really phenomenally important. Only 15 countries have put in place digital platforms to accelerate the educational response to the crisis. So remote forms of work, remote forms of learning, remote forms of actually dealing even with the threat of disease are absolutely a must, and it's much more easier for latecomers to leapfrog and try to get advantage of the leanest, the cheapest, and also the greenest types of technology that are now available. Many will say, but you have the systemic conditions that are not favorable to Africa. Yeah, but let's take notice. Macroeconomic stability rules are being challenged across the globe because of COVID-19. With the recession, and some even say depression, distress signals becoming louder, all this monetarist orthodoxy of Milton Friedman that has been behind all the consensus of Washington and different mainstream policies is evaporating. The state is back to salvage the market's biggest disruption since the Great Depression. Every analyst will tell you that. They would agree that the small margin of maneuver resulting from the instabilities that resulted from the 2008-2009 subprime crisis do not allow for business as usual. The usual recipes don't work. We need enormous stimulus packages. We need shooting debt to GDP ratios above 100% in rich countries, deeply negative interest rates in some of them, like the UK, or monetized fiscal deficits, all unorthodox responses as far as macroeconomic policy is concerned. We can say that economic neoclassical theory is completely turning into its head. We are no longer talking about inflation, we're talking about stagflation, deflation. The way we are dealing with that is also very different, because now public debt has become not an African problem, but a worldwide problem. So the bottom line is this, to finalize. I suppose there will be some improvements to social programs, for sure. We saw during a pandemic how vulnerable people are. We saw how they suffer during the pandemic. There could be improvements in the distribution system, progressivity in the tax system, better services offered to the public, such as health and education, considering those services as investments rather than expenditure. All of these things are on the debate, and they are accepted. The healthcare systems in particular, because we have shortcomings of all kinds that I have already mentioned, we know they are not going to be treated the same way after this crisis. All of a sudden, there is a magic realization of the obvious. Health matters. And for virus and infections, often a threat anywhere is a threat everywhere. So the role of state will be reviewed, like it was in the Great Depression, after the Great Depression. There were some redistributive policies, and the Bretton Woods institutions were created to deal with those at the global level. After the 2008-2009 crisis, again, the G20 were established to deal with the outcomes from that complicated, too big to fail attitude that we had before. And now, well, now we are also going to have to deal with a similar level of crisis, if not bigger. And insofar as Africa is concerned, the number one objective and the number one outcome of this crisis should be an amazing opportunity to deal with the issues of inequality and poverty, because our informality, our isolation, our vulnerabilities have overexposed us. And this is now the time for us to realize business as usual is no longer possible. Thank you.
Absolutely. Business as usual will never be possible again. Thank you so much, Carlos, for a very insightful comment. And thank you for everyone who's joining us and who's been sending messages and questions and comments on YouTube, on the private chat. Keep them coming, and on Twitter as well. Keep them coming. We are receiving them, and we will respond to them all at the end of our speaker series. So after our next speaker goes, we will be able to take on all the questions. So keep them coming, keep on engaging, send us the questions and the messages on Twitter and on YouTube. So thank you very much, Professor Carlos Lopez. And it's an absolute delight to welcome our next speaker for today. In the spirit of the Insaka, we have people from completely diverse backgrounds. So we are jumping from economics to immunology and basic science research. And our next speaker, Dr. Jennifer Mabuka, who is joining us very kindly from a very early morning in Seattle. Jen is a program manager at the African Academy of Sciences. She heads Human Hereditary and Health in Africa, a program, H3 Africa, and has spent a significant part of her career researching basic science on particularly HIV-1 immunology. She's currently a clinical associate professor at the University of Washington in Seattle. So again, thank you for joining us at this very early morning. And we want to welcome you to share with us your insights on how African research scientists are gearing up for COVID-19 research. Join me in welcoming Dr. Mabuka.
Thank you very much, Anne, and thanks everyone for having me this evening, I guess, for most of you. As you've heard, my name is Jennifer. I'm going to share my screen because I have a few slides to share. Okay, I hope you can all see my slides.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. I'm going to be telling you a short story today about how African scientists are gearing up for COVID-19 research. And this is really a summary of some survey that the African Academy of Sciences conducted in an effort to understand what African scientists are interested in and what they are doing as COVID-19 was getting onto the continent. But before we look at the research numbers themselves, I just wanted to paint a picture of what's been happening. So as you can see, this is a summary of the COVID-19 cases as of 17th May. And we all know that we are very thankful that the curves have been different in Africa as compared to the other parts of the world. But as you can see, the numbers are steadily increasing, and what's going to happen in the next few weeks remains uncertain. It's really the million-dollar question. And I really wouldn't want to get into that. I'll leave it to the modelers because, you know, there are many different possibilities that have been proposed. But going right into the research itself, so we set out a survey where we were asking African researchers to let us know what they are, whether they are already conducting any COVID-19 research, and whether they have any plans to get involved in COVID-19 research. One might wonder why this was important to us, but you know, for a long time, sometimes people don't realize that African scientists actually do high-level research and are capable of conducting research independently. Most of the times, there is, if you consider, for example, during the Ebola outbreak in 2014, it's a lot of people coming onto the continent and living a lot of visibility, while the African scientists usually do not get that visibility. But as you can see from this pie chart, and we are trying to cover here all the African regions because the academy is usually interested on the Pan-African level, you can see that there are a number of different individuals that are either conducting or were planning to conduct research at that point. Low numbers from North Africa and Central Africa, but that might also be suggestive of what we usually see at the academy, where we normally, even during grant calls, not receive very many applications from this region, so that might be reflective of that too. So just to zoom in on to those who were actually conducting research, so this is research that already had some funding and was ongoing. Again, you can see that the Western, the Southern, and the Eastern region were leading on that, and lower levels in Central and North Africa. But, you know, the interesting thing is, if you look at the disciplines, as Ian mentioned, for someone like me, I'm always, you know, like interested in the basic and applied sciences. But we've just been talking about the economics and how people will be affected by this. So it was interesting to see, you know, the diversity in the different disciplines that people were interested in, from basic science, epidemiology, social sciences, clinical trials, including herbal medicine, technological innovations, and including PPE manufacturing, which I'll get into in my next slides, but also including data science. And to zoom in a little bit further into some of these different fields, you find that, you know, there are vaccine trials, which we all know about, but, you know, technological innovations, we know about different companies now that have been able to quickly develop PPE on the continent, something that wasn't happening previously. We are able to do surveillance. Pharmacogenomics, for example, is very important. I was speaking to Colin Matsimire recently, where they're leading in Zimbabwe to look at the interplay between, you know, genetics and how it's going to affect all the drugs that are being proposed for the vaccine trials. Mental health has remained an issue that is poorly investigated, or not many of us pay attention to it on the continent, but it also came up as one of the areas that people are interested in. And then for media reporting, I mean, this is very important because, as you can imagine, we have a lot of negative messaging that is going out right now about COVID-19, a lot of conspiracy theories, a lot of negative messaging on clinical trials. So we really do need people that can do the right kind of reporting as regards COVID-19, so that we can, all our efforts can be fruitful. And then maternal and neonatal health, immunology is important, and that's my area, so very exciting. But also, if you think about it, African continent has a very young population. And so the numbers that we see of the people that are actually getting sick and seeking medical help might not be entirely reflective of what is going on. It's possible that the young people are getting infected and they are now showing the symptoms of COVID-19, but eventually we do need to know in the population how many people actually were exposed and infected and got through it. So developing antibodies tests is going to be important for us to be able to do that. So we need an antibody test that will be affordable and that can be used to run millions and millions of tests on the continent. Herbal medicine, as you can see, I know that this is the story from Madagascar, which we probably all know about, but as you can see, there are actually other areas, for example, this is happening in Egypt, where there are herbal medicines that have actually gone through registered clinical trials. Health systems, we're talking about genetics, drug trials, clinical trials, and overall social sciences, looking at attitudes, perceptions, and knowledge of people in the area of COVID-19. So in the recent past, I have been very engaged in clinical trials because of some of the work that I'm doing at the continent, looking at building a clinical trial community. So here I'm just showing you some of the clinical trials that are already underway on the continent. This data was obtained from clinicaltrials.gov, where people register their trials, and some of them are registered in the PACTA trial, which is the African equivalent of clinicaltrials.gov. And you can see here that there are a number of trials, particularly in the northern region, 42 in Egypt, 6 in Tunis, but that might also just be reflective of the fact that the virus was initially or first appeared in Egypt and the northern regions of Morocco and Algeria before the sub-Saharan countries started detecting the spread. And so those countries have had a longer time to prepare and plan for trials, and the hope is that over time, different countries will be able to conduct trials that are relevant to their communities. Again, if you zoom in to look at what these trials are actually studying, you can see it's quite diverse from diagnostic tools. We have observational behavioral studies, herbal medicine, as I mentioned, particularly happening in Northern Africa at the moment, vaccine trials and drug trials, particularly engaging with the WHO Solidarity Trial or the Crown Coronation Trial. So in all this, we know that clinical trials don't just happen. We do have regulatory agencies and ethics and review boards that usually look at the proposals to make sure that they the proposals as presented are safe for the patients and the participants of these trials. And usually we've had a long, we have long period through which these proposals have to go through for the review. Approximately 60 to 90 days on the African continent, but WHO AFRO has worked very closely with the African Vaccine and Regulatory Forum to come up with new guidelines to be able to expedite that for people that are trying to conduct clinical trials in Africa at the moment. And as you can see, now there are new guidelines. The link is shown there, but these are available on the WHO AFRO website. They're available on the African Academy of Sciences website. But the important thing is that the new guidelines propose that for repurposed drugs, for example, those can be reviewed in about 10 days. And for new and drugs or new vaccines, those will be now reviewed in 15 days. And this expedited review does not mean that it's not stringent enough to pay attention to the safety of the patient. It's being able to review this within a scheduled a short time, but still the safety of the patient and the ethics are held at the highest level. The other thing that I would like to mention with regards to WHO AFRO and regulatory and ethics is that they have conducted a very good survey looking at different countries and what kind of platforms they have in terms of being able to submit their proposals online, and the reviews are to happen online, because as we know, with social distancing and institutions being locked down, people are not going to be able to present their proposals physically as happens in some countries. We've had to adjust, as Carlos was saying, to be more savvy, to use online platforms to be able to conduct these processes going forward. Overall, what are the lessons? The lessons we are learning is that we do need to be prepared for epidemics and pandemics. We talk about it all the time, but sometimes governments and institutions are not ready for it and don't put the investments that are required for it. Here, I'm just highlighting some of the things that we have seen so far. We have seen that Africa has the right kind of capacity to be able to quickly respond to a pandemic. In this case, for example, we know that the first sequence was quickly processed in Nigeria, the Redeemer University, by Professor Christian Happy's laboratory. Christian Happy, it doesn't mean that he has previously been studying COVID-19. And I want to proudly also say that he's a member of the H3 Africa Consortium. So we know him very well. He's not been studying COVID-19 prior to this, but he has been very active in studying Ebola in the outbreak in 2014. And beyond that, he has been actively researching Lassa fever, which, as we know, is endemic in Nigeria. But the point is that they can be able to translate those skills and the infrastructure to be able to act quickly when something like this happens. So for those of us, like for me, who work at the academy, where we're constantly talking about capacity building, we have to continue doing that, because as we can see, we can be able to quickly transfer skills from one thing to another when it's required. The other thing that I thought I would emphasize is, recent information, news that in Senegal, they are developing a new test kit that will cost about $1. And the important thing is, while that's very important, I think we need to emphasize the fact that the relationship between Institute Pasteur, where this test kit is being developed, and the British company Mologic was existing from previously. So these collaborations and partnerships need to be built continuously, so that during a time when this need for transfer of skills or repurposing of infrastructure, that happens quickly, and that's what has happened here. And so we know that the Institute Pasteur was initially doing this for Ebola and Lassa fever vaccines, but now they are able to quickly transfer that and use it in COVID-19 test kit development. And also, interesting one in Kenya, where overnight a factory that was usually for cloth development is now a line of surgical mask assembly, and that is basically telling us that we do have the skills and we can do this going forward. Now, for me, I guess the most important thing is lessons learned and how we move post-COVID when that time comes. What are the most challenging things that we've seen, and where are the gaps that we need to continue filling? Obviously, even though we can say that we have a capacity that we've seen is that it's ramping up and very, ready to conduct COVID-19 research, we cannot be complacent. I would say we still need to continue building that capacity in R&D. But for me, seeing headlines like this, Africa countries are struggling to access COVID-19 test reagents on the market, or African countries are struggling to find the coronavirus test kits that they need, reminds me that we still need to think about the big gaps that we have. So we need to go back and look at the R&D pipeline, and basically countries and private sector and philanthropists and friends of Africa need to invest a lot in the innovation pipeline. It doesn't mean that we cannot generate this reagent on the continent. It just means that we haven't taken time invest in this particular area, and now we are suffering the consequences of not investing in that area. But I do believe that we have the capacity in terms of human, and we can be able to, in the future, produce these things on the continent so that we don't find ourselves in the same state. So with that, I just want to thank all my colleagues that have been part of this data collection, and I'll stop there, and thank you very much for listening.
I thank you very much, Jennifer, for those really helpful insights on where research is and what priorities have come out of engaging with African academics. And it's brilliant that a lot of this has come from the continent, that it's not been the typical way of doing research where it's more prescribed about what you can do or what you're able to do. It's come from research priorities that were set by African academics. So thank you very much for sharing that. We've got a load of questions coming from different directions, and I'm delighted that we've got to that point where we can share our thoughts. And so I have a couple of questions for Jen and a few for Carlos. So if you'd like to unmute your microphones, there'll be a flurry of them coming through. And also, if you have questions and if you still want to continue having this conversation on Twitter, on YouTube, and keep them coming, we'll try and address them the best we can in the next few minutes. So the first one is a question that has been raised for Carlos. And how do we explain the logic of African countries asking for debt relief now to assuage the effects of COVID-19 on their economies, but while at the very same time taking a lot of loans from China, from IMF, from the World Bank? Where is the balance in this?
Well, it is important for us to first situate what kind of debt are we talking about, and therefore, being more clear about what kind of debt relief makes sense. We are talking about the public debt, and this public debt is, as I said in my introduction, not an African problem, but rather a world problem. In fact, the best way normally economists judge the sustainability of debt is by comparing its size in relation to the size of the economy, GDP. And the debt to GDP ratio in Africa, on average, is about 50%. Whereas in Europe, or rather in the OECD countries, that includes also the US, Japan, and others, it's 120% right now. That's the average. With the stimulus packages that are being discussed to fight COVID-19 impact, we are, under different modelings approaching 150% debt to GDP ratio. That is 3 times more than what Africa public debt represents. On the same token, people normally say, but in Africa, why are we talking about a debt problem? We are even talking, when it comes to China, debt trap diplomacy. Well, because in order for you to service your debt, to pay your interests, you need to have a certain amount of public resources that are put aside for it. And in fact, what happens is that Africa collects so little taxes in relation to the size of its economy. Our average is 15%, the world average is 35%. That basically we don't have enough space, it's called in our language fiscal space, to deal with all the creative accounting that other countries have. And as a result of that, we have about 25% of our public resources, 1/4 of Africa public resources that goes to service debt. That's a lot. When you know that because of COVID-19, our currencies are depreciating, meaning that the cost of debt in local currency is becoming bigger, larger, because the hard currencies are valuing, we are going from 25% maybe to 30 something, depending on the countries. So that's a lot. Yeah. And therefore we need a response that is global. And in order for us to have that response, because it's a problem that exists around the world, people may say, but why is the responsibility of others to give us debt relief? Well, partly because we have this agenda called Leave No One Behind, which is an agenda of solidarity that is based on the principle that the most vulnerable countries are going to have concessional lending, meaning they will be able to access lending at a very low interest rates. And that's not what is happening. There is definitely a big chunk of our debt that is coming that way. But commensurate to the size of our economies, and particularly the growth of that size since the beginning of this century, almost double size of GDP, the amount that is concessional is not enough. So countries have only two options. They have the option of going into the commercial markets, and the commercial markets are charging 6-7% interest rates, or they can go intermediate, which is not concessional because it's not everything that is available they take, but it's not enough, not commercial because it's too expensive, and in the middle way is China. And China charges 3-4%. That's why they go to China. That has become our #1 creditor. And we are talking about an amount that is not significant for Chinese size, $145 billion, more or less, but it is important for the continent. So we need to negotiate with China, which happens to be also a country that has some responsibility for the COVID-19 one way or another. We need to negotiate with them a good deal. They will say, okay, but we already give you like a fraction of what the commercial lending gives. That's why the response on debt relief has to be in 3-track approach. The first track is how do we deal with debt that is from OECD countries, the so-called Paris Club and all that. A second track, which is how we deal with the commercial debt, because we cannot just erase it because it's private held. They are not going to accept. You can restructure it, you can lower a bit the deal, like you will do personally. And then you have the debt from China that we need to negotiate with them.
Wow, okay. Really interesting. There's been a question for Jennifer, and it's a bit of a two-part question. And the first question is sort of, there's a lot of COVIDization of research, as it were, and that means that a lot of research areas are being neglected, maternal health care, malaria, and so forth. So what is the actual COVID research opportunity cost in the continent? What are we missing? Who's going to pay because of this idea of moving all our resources into COVID research, and at the same time understanding that there's a significant, we are significantly far back in terms of research capacity. So what is the cost benefit here of COVIDization of, to use that term loosely, of research in our context, especially when we have other really pressing health concerns?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I do agree that a lot of resources have been shifted away from very important, healthcare issues, including HIV and TB and maternal and neonatal health. And I think we globally, it's going to be a problem. And we are probably going to see a lot of, the effort that has made, the progress we had made, we might have to kind of restart again. But the benefit and the reason why this is happening, and in my opinion, is the fact that we are dealing with a respiratory virus. It's out there. We don't know how far it's gone, and so we do need to first contain it. So there is the effort to first contain this virus, and once we've contained it, then we can go back to the drawing board and figure out what needs to be done with everything else. I'm not saying that it is okay to take the resources from everything else, because obviously we are going to see a huge problem post-COVID. But if we don't put our efforts on understanding this virus, how far it has spread and what the impact is likely to be, it could wipe all of us, regardless of whether it's HIV or TB. So I think globally, it's understandable that people are shifting their attention to COVID-19. What I think we need to be doing is having conversations with those people that are in the area, in the other fields, so that it's not a complete log of whatever they've been doing in those areas. That needs to be done. Patients need to go in and collect their HIV medicine somehow. That needs to be made possible for them to do, so that they are not, like TB and HIV patients are not meeting on their medications and so on and so forth. So the systems need to be made in such a way that that can be continued alongside the work of COVID-19. But I don't think when you have a virus that is a respiratory virus, as we've seen, you can ignore that and not pay attention to enough attention to it like we've done.
Okay, great. And in the same kind of thread, there's the research that has been conducted by the African Academy of Sciences. Have you noticed any important gaps in terms of research priorities, both geographically or thematically, that are important to raise? And probably where is the sort of largest voices in terms of setting these research priorities coming from, and why is that the case?
Well, so there's some good work that has been done by the African Academy of Sciences. I would encourage people that are interested in that to go to our website and read the summary. But what I would want to say is that for the first time, the African scientists had a voice to actually say what they would like to see research. And basically what that allows us is to be able to conduct research that is relevant to our people. Because, if I'm based in Egypt and somebody else is in West Africa, the issues that they're dealing with might be completely different. And so we need to be able to contextualize a lot of these things and then understand what areas are relevant. And so we've seen a number of things, from herbal medicine to different ways of conducting community engagement. It's spectrum of things that I don't think we have enough time to go into that, but I would really encourage people to look at the report, which is currently present on the Academy's website.
Well, fantastic. Then we should, at the end, we will put a link to this resources, and you can be able to look them up. They'll be there on the AfOx Twitter pages and so forth, and you can be able to link up and read more about what the key areas have come up from this research. Carlos, there's a question for you here. You did mention leveraging on the digital space. And do you think our education system is really ready, or is it geared up to rise to this occasion? And what should we do differently with our education system so we can be able to be prepared to really take advantage of the digital space, and how that can be an important priority moving forward?
I think the two advantages that we have is that we have the largest reservoir of digital natives. And the second is that, as I mentioned, latecomers have some significant incentives to leapfrog. And so those are our advantages. The disadvantages are the educational systems not being adjusted to the realities of the new world, technologically speaking. And also our ecosystems being very poor. That includes regulation, that includes infrastructure, including hard infrastructure like bandwidth, submarine cables, and all the rest. So we have sort of advantages and disadvantages. But I think moving forward, we have to look into how do you transform innovation into consumption? Mm-hmm. You can only transform innovation into consumption through productive processes. And that's what will measure productivity. Otherwise, it's an invention. And we have lots of inventions that didn't go anywhere. They are very interesting from a scientific point of view, but they are not necessarily translatable into something that people consume and that is going to increase productivity. In order for that to happen, you need to have an appeal to the consumption of such an invention or such an innovation. And when we look forward, where is going to be the largest adaptive demographics for new innovations? It's where the young people are. You are not going to expect that robotization, automation, artificial intelligence is going to be easier to be used by 8 years old in relation to 20 years old. And where are the 20 years old going to be? Well, we know from the projections that 2/3 of them are going to be in Africa and India. And therefore, these are the regions where you can actually translate some of your innovations into consumer markets for the future. That's the advantage of the digital natives. Obviously, countries that are capable of mastering the ecosystem that is going to be the best to create the innovation are going to benefit from intellectual property, and they are going to make money out of it. But they will still need for that money to be increasing, for the growth of that capital to be sustainable, of the large usage of that innovation. And that is going to be where the digital natives are.
Mm-hmm. And just to follow up on that variation that you were talking about, there's been such a, a varied range of, capacity and response across Africa. What South Africa has done is significantly different from what the path that Tanzania has chosen to take. So could you speak a little bit about why we have this huge variation? Has it got anything to do with economic policies, or is it a little bit more on the behavioral social side of things? And how could we go about making this, an African problem and solving it from an African perspective, if we should at all?
Well, you see, if you look into the African Union attempt to have some regional approach to the efforts, you will have to admit that we have been slightly better organized in the continent than we were when Ebola struck. There was no CDC to start with. There was very little networking of the likes that Jennifer is mentioning. There was no real larger effort by institutions like the African Academy of Sciences. So all of this we are seeing now emerging, and it's still fragile because we have limitation of means. But the response is much more clearer today than it was during Ebola. Yet, you have a large dimension of this crisis that is not really going to make all countries adopt the same policies, because there is a bit of politics into the virus. And the politics within the virus is going to create different forms of governance response. You have the populists that will respond in a certain way, will tell you that, as I said, traditional healing is going to be the response. I have nothing against traditional healing. On the contrary, I think it should be valued, but it should be scientifically proven. And this kind of, sort of differences are to be expected. And I think at the end of the day, we are going to learn from all of this. And certainly when we respond next time, we'll be even better prepared.
One can only hope for that. Hey, Jen, let me bring you into the politics of it a little bit. And as you've seen this play out severally, there's mistrust of the medicines and interventions that come from the West. At the same time, we are still struggling with our research capacity to produce and manufacture and provide sufficient vaccines and so forth in the continent. At the same time, there's a tension between political leadership and what they are proposing versus what scientists think is the best thing to do. I mean, we've seen this come to play even here in the UK just a couple of days ago. So how do we disintegrate this information? How does an everyday person decide how to move between these two tensions of what politics and policy makers are pushing and how they're living versus what scientists are actually pushing for as good interventions? And also, if you could speak to the differences in prioritization that is coming from the West versus what is coming from the continent.
And that's a very broad question. I'll give it my best shot. I'll start with the last one. In terms of prioritization, I think we need to move away from a one-shoe-fits-all perspective, because it just doesn't work that way. And honestly, I think African governments have been cognizant of that, and some of the responses and guidelines that they've given their communities are more relevant for those people. For example, if I speak about what I see going on in Kenya, they know that people have to go out and make money, $2 or $3 every day for them to buy food, and therefore you can't have a complete lockdown. for example. So I think we need to prioritize what we take in terms of policy or guidelines, and think about our communities and what we have in terms of resources, and then determine what we can feasible to implement and what we cannot implement on the continent. So that's number one. In terms of the messaging, I think this is a big challenge. Social media platforms can be both good and bad. We are using it today in a very good way as we talk. You're in the UK, I'm in Seattle, people are joining us from Africa. We can go back and forth on that, but it's also been a platform where a lot of negative messaging has happened with regard to COVID-19, and communities and people actually, it's difficult. I can only imagine how difficult it is for people to just kind of look through all that messaging. I mean, my call really is for people to let the experts lead and listen to the experts. And that includes both the government and the community people. If they can listen to the experts, and for the experts, it's our responsibility for those of us who work directly with communities, break this information down for communities. So I know that it's a difficult time. We understand we cannot do what we call community engagement in the usual way that it's done because of the social distancing and everything. But again, we can use these platforms that social media provides us to tell our people what is the truth and what is false about all this COVID-19. Because with all the negative messaging, at the end of the day, we will not have a concerted response, as Carlos is saying. Overall, it's a better response than Ebola, but we could do better. And it just needs a lot of understanding between the experts, the government, and the local communities. We can't get anywhere if we leave communities or people that are not in our space of science and all outside. We need to bring them along, and we need to break down the information so that they understand what is happening and how they can contribute positively to end this pandemic.
Absolutely. Now, I would love to go through all the questions that have been raised, but unfortunately, in the interest of time, I want to just bring a close to just with one last question for either of you to take, or both of you. And it's really about data and the information that is coming, just to follow on from what Jennifer said. In the beginning, Carlos, you talked about the predictions that were there from international community that are not really playing out as people predicted in the continent. At the same time, there's mistrust in some of the information that's coming from our governments, given the rates of testing and so forth. So there's a flurry of information that could be accurate, but we're not quite sure what is and what isn't. So whose data do we trust, and how can this data be synthesized in a way that is consistent and that supports, inform the capacity for our governments and for individuals to make informed decisions on the best choices moving forward? This is both in terms of scientific information, but also social economic interventions and so forth. So what are your thoughts about this in a couple of sentences?
Maybe Jennifer, you go first.
What do I have to say for that? Yeah, so I think, we know that African governments are having a challenge with testing, as I highlighted. So the numbers might not be completely accurate, but the numbers give us a picture of what's happening. And hopefully over time, we will have better numbers or more accurate numbers. And I think for me, it is using the numbers that they have, but also using, we now have modelers that can use those numbers and put in all these other factors that might be playing a role, so that they can give us an idea of what it might look like. And, if we have that, again, modelers as experts, and we have the data, putting the two together, I think we can be able to make projections that then can inform decisions going forward.
Well, this year's Nobel Prize on Economics is on random use of data. And we can learn 2 or 3 things about both the opportunities and the limitations of that type of approach, because we are dealing, as Jennifer said, with the second best data. We don't have the most accurate, we have the second best. And it will be really criminal not to use the second best, because it's what we have. I would be the first to be a bit concerned about even GDP calculations in Africa, because we have only about 17 countries in Africa that have their national accounts up to date. Civil registration, we have about 60% of the Africans don't have civil registration up to date or in existence. Land registry is the same problem. So we can go on with all data series. We have huge difficulties. But that's why you replace that with projections, and the projections are as good as your sampling and how you use your sampling. Randomize and is one of the techniques. We have to deal with what we have, and I think people really have to pay attention to what the data is already telling us. May not be the best picture and the best knowledge, but it is what we have.
Okay, so we start with where we are and move from there. Well, in the pre-COVID era, I would have loved to welcome you all for a glass of wine after such an interesting conversation. But unfortunately, I think we're going to have to settle for a virtual one this time round. Please join me in saying a very, very big AfOx thank you to Professor Carlos Lopes and Dr. Jennifer Mabuka for joining us and sharing those incredible insights. And a very, very big thank you to everybody who's joined us on YouTube, on Twitter, and our other social media handles. Thank you very much for being part of this conversation. And I would like to welcome you for our next one, which will be on the 2nd of July. Please look out for information about that on our website, as well as on our social media handles. We very much wish you the very best in these really unprecedented, challenging times. We hope that you all keep safe, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one. On behalf of everybody at the AfOx and the team that has helped put this together, thank you and have yourself a lovely, lovely day.
Thank you.